At the reading of my grandfather's billion-dollar will, the air was thick with the sound of winning. My billionaire grandfather left everyone millions of dollars. My father got 8 million. My mother got 5. My brother got 4. The room was a symphony of shifting silk and smug sighs of relief. Then the lawyer reached the bottom of the pile. He didn't slide a check across the table to me. He slid a single, cream-colored envelope. No money, no assets. Just a piece of paper that looked like a goodbye note, my name written on the front in my grandfather's handwriting. My father leaned back with that satisfied half-smile, the one that says I've always known my place is at the top. My brother Fenton didn't even try to hide his smirk. He leaned over, his voice a sharp whisper that cut through the quiet. Guess you weren't worth the ink, Serafina. My mother looked away, her silence a polished shield. I said nothing. I just sat there, the porcelain-skinned ghost they had spent 27 years ignoring. But Alaric Beaumont was a man who measured every move like a grandmaster. This letter wasn't a mistake. It was a trap. I felt the weight of it in my hands, heavier than any check. When I broke the gold wax seal, I didn't see a farewell. I saw a list. A list of every time they had been cruel, every time they had been greedy, and every time they thought I wasn't listening. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing off the mahogany walls. I read just the first 3 lines aloud. My father's hand, reaching for his champagne, stopped midair. The laughter in the room didn't just fade, it vanished. I looked up at the people who had spent my life making me feel small, and for the first time, I saw it. The cold, paralyzed look of people who realized they had just handed their leashes to the one person they never bothered to love. Growing up in the Hale house felt like living in a grand theater where I was the only person in the audience. The house itself was a place of tall ceilings and cold marble, designed to echo the voices of people who had important things to say. My brother, Fenton, was the star of every show. From the time he could walk, he was taught to take up space. He would march into the dining room, his voice booming as he bragged about his grades or his latest sports trophy. My father would clap him on the back, his eyes shining with pride, while my mother smiled her perfect, distant smile. To them, Fenton was a bright light. I was just the shadow he cast. I was 27 now, but the feeling of being the quiet one started much earlier. While Fenton was busy demanding attention, I was busy watching. I learned how to read the small things, the way my father's jaw tightened when he was lying, or the way my mother's hands shook when she was unhappy. I became a master of the background. I was the slender girl in the corner of the room, the one who brought the tea and never asked for a seat at the table. My fair, porcelain skin made me look fragile, and my family treated me like a piece of glass they didn't want to bother moving. Serafina is so easy, my mother would tell her friends. She doesn't need much. What she really meant was that I didn't cause trouble. I didn't ask for a new car like Fenton did or demand a larger allowance. I stayed in my room with my books and my thoughts, developing a gray-blue gaze that saw everything and revealed nothing. Fenton would mock me, calling me the ghost, laughing because I didn't fight back. He thought my silence was weakness. He thought that, because I wasn't screaming for power, I didn't want any. But he didn't realize that while he was talking, I was collecting secrets. I noticed which business deals made my father nervous and which friends my mother truly disliked. I was underweight and overlooked, but I was resilient. My grandfather, Alaric, was the only one who ever caught me watching. He would wink at me from across a crowded room, a secret signal between 2 people who knew that the quietest person usually has the most control. In the Hale house, ambition was loud and messy. Fenton and my father were always competing, always trying to prove who is the strongest. They were so busy looking at themselves in the mirror that they forgot to look at me. I sat slightly withdrawn from the table, my hands steady and my mind sharp. I wasn't waiting for them to love me anymore. I was simply waiting for my time to speak. When Grandpa Alaric's health began to fade, the Grand Beaumont estate changed. It became a place where my family showed up like they were checking off a list. My father, Bertram, would walk into the sick room with his phone in his hand. He would check his watch every 2 minutes, talk about stock prices, and call it a visit. My brother, Fenton, was even worse. He would stand by the door as if he were afraid the illness might jump onto his expensive suit. They treated Grandpa like a piece of business that needed to be finished, not a man who was dying. I was the only one who stayed. I spent long, quiet afternoons sitting by his bed. I wasn't there because I wanted his money. I was there because he was the only person who had ever truly looked at me. I adjusted his pillows when his breath got heavy, and I made sure his tea was always just the right temperature. We didn't need to speak much. In the quiet, we understood each other perfectly. One rainy evening, while the rest of the family was downstairs arguing about which of his cars they would sell first, Grandpa reached out and took my hand. His grip was thin and felt like old paper, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He watched me for a long time before he spoke. "Do you know why they are so loud, Serafina?" he whispered. "They want to be heard, Grandpa," I replied softly. He shook his head and gave me a tired smile. "No, they are loud because they are trying to hide what is inside them. They think money is a prize. They think it will make them bigger." He paused, looking toward the door where the sounds of the family shouting drifted up the stairs. "But they are wrong. Money doesn't change who a person is. It just removes the mask. It shows the world what was already there when the person thought no one was looking." He squeezed my hand then, his silver signet ring cold against my skin. "I have watched you, my quiet girl. You don't wear a mask. You don't have to." At the time, I thought he was just being kind. I didn't realize he was giving me a warning. He was testing me, watching to see if I would stay when there was nothing to gain. While the others were busy counting their future millions, I was learning the truth about their hearts. Grandpa knew that soon, the masks would come off for everyone. He was already deciding that I was the only one strong enough to handle what was underneath. The day of the will reading felt like the coldest day of the year, even though the sun was shining outside. We gathered in the Beaumont boardroom, a room filled with dark wood walls and heavy velvet curtains that seemed to suck the light out of the air. It was a place built for power and serious secrets. A long, polished table sat in the middle of the room, shining like ice under the dim lamps. My father, Bertram, didn't just walk into the room, he took it over. He marched to the head of the table and sat down in the largest chair as if it already belonged to him. He straightened his expensive silk tie and checked his gold cufflinks, looking like a king waiting to be crowned. My mother, Mahola, sat beside him, her back perfectly straight. She looked like a statue made of ice, her hazel eyes scanning the room but never really looking at me. Fenton was the worst of all. He leaned back in his leather chair, swinging his foot and checking his phone. He looked bored, but I could see the greedy spark in his green eyes. To him, this wasn't a funeral or a sad day. It was a payday. He kept making small, mocking jokes under his breath. "I hope the old man didn't spend it all on those dusty books of his," Fenton whispered, loud enough for me to hear. He glanced at me and smirked. "Maybe he left you his library, Serafina. You're the only one boring enough to read them." I said nothing. I sat slightly away from the table, keeping my shoulders relaxed and my hands steady in my lap. I was the girl in the charcoal dress that no one noticed, the one they thought was too weak to matter. The air in the room was thick with the smell of old paper and the heavy scent of my mother's perfume. It felt like everyone was holding their breath, but for different reasons. My family was smug. They were so sure of themselves. They spoke about the millions as if the money was already in their pockets. They talked about new houses, faster cars, and bigger business deals. They were so busy being loud and confident that they didn't notice the lawyer, a stern man with gray hair, looking at them with a strange expression. He placed a thick folder on the table, and the sound hit the wood like a gavel. The room finally went quiet. The games were over, and the truth was about to walk through the door. The lawyer, Mr. Ross, opened the heavy folder and cleared his throat. The sound was like a signal. My father leaned forward, his eyes hungry for the numbers he expected to hear. My mother gripped her pearl necklace, her face as stiff as a mask. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the heater in the corner. "We will begin with the smaller gifts first," Mr. Ross said. He looked over his glasses at me. "To Serafina Hale, Alaric Beaumont has left a specific personal token." He reached into the folder and pulled out a small, plain envelope. He slid it across the long table. It looked tiny and lonely on the polished wood. My father stared at it, and then he let out a short, sharp laugh. Fenton didn't even try to be polite. He leaned back and roared with laughter, the sound bouncing off the dark walls. "A personal token?" Fenton gasped, wiping his eyes. "Open it, Serafina. Let's see if he left you enough for a bus ride home." With steady hands, I picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside were 2 $20 bills and 1 $10 bill. $50. That was it. I held the money in my hands, feeling the crisp paper between my fingers. I didn't cry. I didn't look away. I simply stared at the bills, noting the strange, tiny marks near the edges that looked like accidental scratches. $50, my father boomed, his voice full of a cruel kind of relief. Well, I suppose that proves it. Dad always knew who was actually going to lead this family. He knew who was worth the investment and who was just there. "It is a bit embarrassing, isn't it?" my mother whispered, her hazel eyes finally meeting mine with a look of pity that felt worse than a slap. "But Serafina, you never did ask for much. I suppose your grandfather thought you'd be happy with a little pocket money." Fenton leaned over and flicked the edge of one of the bills. "Don't spend it all in one place, Ghost. Maybe you can buy a new book to hide behind." They were all smiling now. The tension that had been in the room was gone, replaced by a cold, mean energy. They thought the game was over. They thought they had won because they saw the $50 as my total value. They were so busy laughing and mocking me that they didn't notice Mr. Ross hadn't moved. He was watching them with a look that was as cold as a winter morning. I looked at the bills one more time and saw my grandfather's mask theory coming true right before my eyes. They thought I was nothing, and because of that, they were finally showing me exactly who they were. The room was still filled with the sound of Fenton's laughter when Mr. Ross reached into his briefcase once more. This time, he didn't pull out a check. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope with a heavy gold wax seal. The room went quiet, not because they were respectful, but because they were confused. My father's smile faltered as the lawyer slid the envelope toward me, right next to the $50. "There is a second part to the will," Mr. Ross said, his voice as sharp as a knife. "A private letter for Serafina Hale." My family watched with narrow eyes as I broke the seal. The paper inside was heavy and expensive. As I began to read the first few lines, the air in the room seemed to vanish. My father leaned in, his face turning a dark shade of red. Fenton stopped smirking. I cleared my throat and read the words my grandfather had written specifically for this moment. I, Alaric Beaumont, hereby appoint my granddaughter, Seraphina Hale, as the sole trustee and executioner of my entire estate, I read aloud. My voice was steady, even though my heart was racing. All funds, properties, and businesses are now under her absolute control. That's impossible, my father shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I was promised $8 million. Fenton was promised 4. You were promised advances, I said, looking up from the letter. My gray-blue eyes were calm, matching the subtle, knowing smile on my face. But according to this, those millions are revocable. That means I have the power to take them back at any time. The silence that followed was so deep it felt like the room had frozen in time. My mother gripped the edge of the table, her face turning pale. Fenton looked like he had been slapped. They realized that the quiet one they had mocked just minutes ago now held their entire lives in her hands. The millions they were already planning to spend weren't theirs yet. They belonged to the estate, and I was the one who decided if they deserved to keep a single cent. I looked at the $50 on the table and then back at my family. The marks on the bills weren't accidents. They were a code that only someone who paid attention would find. Grandpa had used the little money to show me their true faces, and now he had given me the big money to make sure they never wore those masks again. I wasn't just the girl in the background anymore. I was the person in charge, and for the first time in my life, the room was finally listening to me. My father reached for the letter, but I pulled it back just out of his reach. My movements were slow and calm. The room felt smaller now, and the air was thick with the shock of my family. Bertram's face was twisted in a mix of anger and fear. He couldn't understand how the power had shifted so quickly. I turned the page of the letter and looked at the list my grandfather had written in his sharp, clear handwriting. This is called a clawback clause, I said, my voice steady and quiet. Grandpa Alaric didn't just give you money. He gave you a test. These millions are not yours to keep unless you follow his rules. And the rules are very simple. I looked at my mother, who was hiding her face behind her hands, and then at Fenton, whose smug smile had completely disappeared. I began to read the requirements out loud. The letter stated that the money was an advance on good behavior. If any member of the family acted with cruelty, greed, or disrespect toward the estate, or toward me, the funds would be pulled back instantly. Section 4 I read, pointing to a paragraph near the bottom. Any attempt to bully, mock, or diminish the trustee will result in the immediate loss of all inherited assets. The trustee has the final say. No court, no lawyer, and no argument can change her decision. Fenton let out a shaky breath. You're joking. You can't just take it away because I made a joke. It wasn't a joke, Fenton, I replied, looking him right in the eyes. My gray-blue gaze didn't blink. It was a choice. And every choice you make from now on has a price. Grandpa saw how you treated him when he was sick. He saw how you treated me when you thought I had nothing. He didn't want his hard work to fund people who only care about themselves. My father stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. I am your father, Seraphina. You wouldn't dare take my money. I looked at the $50 still sitting on the table. Grandpa told me that money removes the mask, Dad. Your mask fell off the moment you laughed at me for being poor. If you want to keep that $5 million, you will have to learn how to be a different kind of man. One who shows respect. The room stayed silent. My family, who had always been so loud and dominant, now sat as still as statues. They weren't looking at a gentle girl anymore. They were looking at the person who owned their future. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my bag. The power hadn't changed me, but it had finally given me the space to stand tall. The silence in the room did not last long. My father's shock quickly turned into a cold, burning anger. He took a step toward me, his shadow falling across the table. Bertram was a large man who was used to getting his way by being the loudest person in the room. He leaned down, placing his heavy hands on the polished wood, trying to make me feel small again. "Listen to me, Serafina," he hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "This is a mistake. You are a young girl who knows nothing about business or millions of dollars. You are going to hand that letter to me right now, and we are going to tell the lawyer that you aren't fit to handle this. If you don't, I will make sure you never have a place in this family again." Beside him, Fenton stood up too. He didn't look like a charming brother anymore. His face was twisted with greed. "He's right. You think you can hold us hostage? You're just a ghost, Serafina. You've always been weak. Give us the money, or things are going to get very ugly for you." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I sat with my shoulders relaxed and my hands folded on top of the cream-colored envelope. I looked at their angry faces and realized that for the first time in my life, their noise didn't scare me. I looked at Mr. Ross, who was waiting for my command. "Mr. Ross," I said, my voice calm and clear. "My father and brother are currently violating the respect clause of the trust. Please freeze all immediate cash advances for Bertram Hale and Fenton Hale. I want their bank accounts locked until I decide otherwise." The lawyer nodded once and tapped a few keys on his laptop. The room went dead quiet again. My father laughed, a harsh and dry sound. "You can't do that. It takes weeks to move money." Just then, my father's phone buzzed on the table. A second later, Fenton's phone chimed. They both grabbed their devices. I watched as the color drained from their faces. The text messages from the bank were clear. Their access had been denied. The millions they were just bragging about had vanished with one sentence from me. You actually did it," Fenton whispered, his voice shaking. He looked at his phone as if it had betrayed him. "I am not a ghost anymore, Fenton," I said softly. I stood up, smoothing my charcoal dress. I was tall enough to meet my father's eyes. And I am not weak. I am the one who decides if you get to live the life you want. If you want your money back, you will sit down, you will be quiet, and you will wait for me to permit you to speak. My father sank back into his chair, looking older than I had ever seen him. The power had truly shifted. They weren't the masters of the house anymore. They were just people waiting for a check. When the anger failed, the room shifted into a different kind of cold. My mother, Mahola, finally spoke. She reached across the table, her hand trembling as she tried to touch my arm. Her hazel eyes were full of tears that looked real, but I had seen her cry for far less important things. "Serafina, honey," she whispered, her voice soft and shaking. "We are your family. We are your blood. Surely you don't mean to treat your own mother and father this way? We only want what is best for you. We were just surprised, that's all." It was a stressful day. My father changed his face, too. The red anger drained away, replaced by a look of deep sadness. "I know I've been hard on you, Serafina, but I did it to make you strong. I did it because I love you. Can't we just go home and talk about this as a family? You don't need a lawyer to stand between us." I looked at them, and for a moment, I felt the old habit of wanting to please them. It would be so easy to say it was okay. It would be so easy to give in and feel their love again. But then I remembered the long nights in the hospital. I remembered sitting by Grandpa Alaric's bed while he struggled to breathe. I remembered checking my phone, hoping for a single message from them asking if I was okay. The messages never came. I remembered the dinner parties where they talked over me as if I were a piece of furniture. I remembered the years of being the easy one because they didn't care enough to find out who I really was. Their love had always been a prize I had to earn, but it was never something they gave for free. Where was this love at the funeral? I asked. My voice was quiet, but it filled the room. Where was this family bond when I was sitting in the hospital alone? You weren't worried about my blood then. You were worried about your meetings and your cars. My mother flinched as if I had struck her. We were busy, Serafina. You know how the world is. I know exactly how your world is, I replied. I stood up and pulled my bag over my shoulder. In your world, love is a deal. You only care about me now because I have something you want. But Grandpa taught me that silence tells you more than words. Your silence when I was hurting told me everything I needed to know. I didn't wait for them to answer. I could feel their eyes on me, not with love, but with the desperate look of people who had lost their power. The price of their cruelty was finally due, and for the first time, I wasn't the one paying it. Walking into the Beaumont estate as its owner felt different from visiting as a guest. The heavy oak doors didn't feel like they were shutting me out anymore. They felt like they were guarding me. I stood in the grand entrance hall, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor. For the first time, I didn't feel the need to walk on my tiptoes. I took a deep breath of the air that smelled of beeswax and old books, and I finally felt at home. The first thing I did was hire my own team. I didn't want the people my father had picked. I found a new lawyer and a group of advisors who looked at me with respect, not because of my last name, but because I was the one making the decisions. I spent my days in Grandpa Alaric's old study. I sat in his large leather chair, surrounded by the walls of books that Fenton had teased me about. Those books were full of the wisdom I needed to run this empire. I set very clear boundaries. I changed the security codes on the gates and the front door. My family could no longer barge in whenever they wanted to demand money or attention. If they wanted to see me, they had to make an appointment through my office, just like everyone else. It wasn't about being mean. It was about protection. I was building a wall around the peace I had worked so hard to find. I also began to use the Beaumont wealth for things that mattered. I started a trust for people who were overlooked by their own families, and I gave money to libraries and schools. I didn't hold big parties or put my name on gold signs. I did it quietly, just like Grandpa would have done. I learned that you don't have to be loud to have a huge impact on the world. Sometimes, I would stand by the large window in the study and look out over the gardens. I could see the city in the distance, busy and noisy. Down there, my father and Fenton were likely still trying to figure out how they had lost control. But up here, it was quiet. I wasn't the slender, invisible girl anymore. I was Serafina Hale, the head of the Beaumont estate. I had found my voice, and I had used it to build a life where I never had to be small again. I was finally standing tall, and the view from the top was clearer than I ever imagined. A year had passed since the day of the will reading, and the world felt different now. I sat on the stone bench in the center of the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and orange. The Beaumont estate was silent, but it was a warm, comfortable kind of silence. It was the kind of quiet Grandpa Alaric had always loved. I thought back to the $50 that had started everything. At the time, it felt like an insult, a way to show the world that I was worth nothing. But now I understood the genius of my grandfather's plan. He didn't give me that small amount of money because he was being cheap. He gave it to me as a mirror. He wanted me to see exactly how my family would act when they thought I had no power. Without that moment, I might have spent the rest of my life trying to earn their love. I might have kept making myself small, hoping they would finally notice me. But the $50 removed their masks. It showed me that their love was only for people with millions in the bank. Once I saw that truth, I was finally free. The millions of dollars in the Beaumont Trust were a great responsibility, but they weren't the real gift. The true inheritance was the clarity I found in that cold boardroom. Grandpa Alaric had given me the courage to stand my ground and the strength to say no. He showed me that being quiet isn't the same as being weak. You can be the calmest person in the room and still be the one holding all the keys. I looked down at my hands. They were steady, just like they had been when I held that first letter. I was no longer the invisible daughter or the gentle ghost. I was a woman who knew her own value. I had built a life filled with real friends and meaningful work. I had created a world where respect was more important than a bank balance. As the last bit of sun disappeared behind the trees, I stood up and walked toward the house. I didn't hurry and I didn't look back. I had learned the most important lesson of all. Power isn't about how loud you can yell. It's about knowing who you are when the rest of the world is screaming. I was finally whole, I was finally seen, and I would never make myself small again. I am Serafina Hale, and I have finally found my peace.